15 of the best yellow dresses in film. By this point, you should already know the drill, but for those of you coming into this series on its 3rd episode, today we're going to be taking a look at 15 of the best yellow dresses in film. As always, they'll be listed in no particular order, and we'll be focusing on yellow outfits with an interesting backstory, important symbolic meaning, a lasting cultural legacy, or simply look awesome. Now for a few disclaimers. There are lots of movies with amazing costuming that could be featured in this series, but for the sake of keeping things interesting, I'll be trying to keep repeats to a minimum. So before you get upset about a certain movie not making the cut, there's a high possibility that I decided to save it for a different episode. It's also important to keep in mind that I haven't seen every single film ever made, and it's highly possible that I might overlook a dress that you consider one of the best. So feel free to leave a comment down below if you didn't see your favorite. And it has to be said, but this is based on my personal preferences. So if you see a recurring theme when it comes to the types of dresses included in this video, that's why. Also, this isn't really an issue with any other colors in the series, but I want to make it clear that for this video, we're talking about yellow dresses specifically, not gold. Yes, there's a difference. Now that that's out of the way, let's get into it. Shakespeare in Love. Released during the period drama craze of the 1990s, Shakespeare in Love was one of the most critically acclaimed films of 1998, winning 7 of its 13 Academy Award nominations, including costume design for Sandy Powell. The film is a fictional depiction of a love affair between playwright William Shakespeare and Viola de Lesseps, a young woman who disguises herself as a man in order to audition for the theater. The film makes numerous allusions to Shakespeare's plays, implying that his work drew inspiration from events that occurred in his actual life. Taking place in London in 1593, the costume design in the film is remarkably faithful to the time period, apart from the usual Hollywood deviations like Gwyneth Paltrow's flowy hair or Joseph Fiennes' sexy shirts. Some of the most eye-catching and elaborate costumes in the film are worn by Dame Judi Dench as Queen Elizabeth. With her wired ruffs, hanging sleeves, peplum bodices, and voluminous skirts, she physically takes up more space than her peers, highlighting how she holds the highest rank in the country. Her dresses feature an assortment of vibrant colors, intricate embroidery, and jeweled embellishments, not only signifying her immense wealth, but allowing for Viola to appear far more modest and down-to-earth in comparison. To the modern eye, the Queen's wardrobe may come across as too flashy, but based on actual portraiture from the late 16th century, she really did dress in this ostentatious manner. As a well-to-do young woman, Viola's wardrobe is more intricate than those of lower station, and many of her gowns feature golden embroidery that make her status immediately apparent, even in a contemporary context. She wears an array of gowns in different styles, with their varying levels of rigidness and formality being directly influenced by her circumstances. Note that at times when she's unhappy or receiving bad news, her wardrobe is far more stifling, physically and metaphorically weighing her down. For the majority of the film, Viola appears to wear styles that more closely resemble fashions of the 1560s instead of the 1590s, with her gowns featuring smaller ruffs, narrow sleeves, and sheer partlets. This was likely done on purpose to tie into how the character doesn't really abide by the status quo, while also helping her appear more youthful to a contemporary audience. Although my personal favorite of Viola's ensembles is this blue number, which suits Gwyneth Paltrow beautifully, the dress that actually put this movie on the list is the yellow and white number that she dons when she goes to court to receive the Queen's approval of her arranged marriage. This gown features many recognizable elements from the late Elizabethan era, including an inverted triangle stomacher, bombast sleeves, a dramatic ruff, and the drum or French farthingale, a skirt style which was popularized by the Queen in the 1580s. Compared to what Viola had worn previously in the film, this gown is far more ornate, a purposeful choice as it allows her to fit in with the rest of the Queen's court, at least on a formal level. Because she's wearing yellow and white, she still stands out, as most of the nobles are actually dressed in what appears to be the Spanish style, which was rather somber and devoid of color. Compared to the other gowns she's worn previously, this dress takes up more space. But unlike the Queen, Viola's silhouette is symbolic of how she's hiding her true self from others and using the gown as a sort of disguise to play the part that is expected of her. Jodhaa Akbar. Jodhaa Akbar is a lavish, epic historical drama set in the 16th century, which dramatizes the political marriage between the Muslim Mughal Emperor Akbar and the Rajput Hindu princess Jodhaa Bai, which against all odds blossoms into true love. Costume designer Nita Lula has actually said that this was the most challenging film that she's ever worked on, as she not only had to create the wardrobe for the principal characters, but those of the entire cast, from Akbar's political rivals to the random commoners on the street, resulting in nearly 2,600 costumes combined. Lula was also tasked with balancing historical accuracy and modern fashion trends, using both paintings and books from the time period in her research to dictate the direction she went in. Because of these requirements, the entire costuming process took a year and a half from start to finish, a worthwhile endeavor which certainly translates on screen. To highlight the film's primary plot point, which focuses on the conflict between Hinduism and Islam, the Rajputs are dressed in rich yellows, oranges, and greens, while the Mughals wear muted browns, whites, beiges, and golds. It's a striking contrast which is somehow still complementary, mirroring the eventual understanding and love between Akbar and Jodhaa. The era was known for its grandiosity, and as a result, Jodhaa's costumes feature rich gold embroidery and elaborate jewelry, all of which were made using centuries-old traditional techniques. After Jodhaa marries Akbar, she is taken to the palace where she makes her entrance in a stunning, bright yellow outfit. Jodhaa wears yellow throughout the film, including during the iconic scene when Akbar searches for her in an ocean of similarly dressed women, but this look is a cut above the rest. Like many of Jodhaa's costumes throughout the film, she wears a sheer dupatta, a shawl, with a maroon choli, a crop blouse, and a lehenga, a flared skirt. Each of these pieces feature a maroon border which has stones and gold foil embedded into the metallic embroidery. Despite being covered in jewels from head to toe, the entire look remains balanced, allowing Jodhaa's beauty to shine and making a lasting impression on the rest of the palace. Most fans of the film will probably cite one of Jodhaa's many red outfits as their favorites, like her ornate wedding ensemble, but there's something about this specific look that I can't keep my eyes off of. The film was incredibly influential in the wedding world, and even now, more than a decade after its release, Indian brides and grooms continue to don bridal designs inspired by Nita Lula's extraordinary costumes and the remarkable love story. Dangerous liaisons. In Hollywood, there are always periods of time when certain historical eras are more trendy than others. In the 1990s, it was all about England and the Regency period a la Austen Mania. In the 1950s and 60s, ancient Egypt was all the rage. And in the 1970s and 80s, people couldn't get enough of the Age of Enlightenment, hence the rise of films like Amadeus, Barry Lyndon, and The Slipper and the Rose. The popularity of this time period made the 1782 French novel Les Liaisons dangereuses ripe for the picking, and two different films that took notes from the story entered production around the same time. 1988's Dangerous Liaisons was based on the 1985 play, which itself was an adaptation of the novel, while 1989's Valmont took sole inspiration from the original work. If you sit down and watch the two, it's immediately apparent which is superior, with Dangerous Liaisons blowing Valmont completely out of the water. Dangerous Liaisons is even considered to be one of the greatest period dramas of all time, with costume designer James Acheson receiving an Oscar for his work on the film. Meanwhile, Valmont, which was nominated in the same category the following year, is largely forgotten. Set in pre-revolution Paris, Dangerous Liaisons follows the manipulative and influential Marquise de Martille, played by Glenn Close, who makes a bet with the similarly cunning Vicomte de Valmont, played by Jean Malkovich, to seduce the virtuous and married Madame de Tourville, played by Michelle Pfeiffer. The film opens with a scene of Martille and Valmont getting dressed, which not only highlights their wealth, boredom, and vanity, but also how much research the production did in regard to historical accuracy, with the characters actually being dressed correctly for the most part. Like the novel it was based on, Dangerous Liaisons was initially supposed to take place in the 1780s, but according to Acheson, director Stephen Frears opted to change the setting to the 1760s as the hair, hats, and dresses of that era were significantly less in your face, allowing the characters to be the main focus as opposed to their clothing. When people think of the 18th century, the first thing that comes to mind are the gigantic hairstyles worn by the likes of Marie Antoinette. But those large, elaborate hairstyles actually didn't become a genuine trend until the 1770s, eventually reaching their peak in the 1780s before dying out post-revolution, for obvious reasons. Because Dangerous Liaisons takes place in the 1760s, the women sport smaller, simpler hairstyles, although they're notably missing the powder that created the gray look that became synonymous with hair of that time period. According to Acheson, they experimented with the more historically accurate powdered style of hair and makeup. But because the film is so character-focused with many close-ups, it didn't translate well on camera, so they opted to save the flashy done-up look until the end as a symbol of Martille's fall from grace. Martille dons this yellow riding habit when she goes to visit the young and naive Cécile Volanges. Secretly wishing for Cecile's ruin as she's engaged to Martille's former lover, Martille convinces Cecile to welcome Valmont's sexual advances, effectively ruining the girl's chances of a respectable future. Riding habits took notes from men's clothing, and by the mid-18th century were considered a fashionable, yet informal form of daywear for women, being worn for hunting, walking, riding, obviously, and traveling. Prior to this point, Martille mainly wears robe à la française, or sack-back gowns, which was the most common dress style amongst French aristocrats during the 1760s, so I find the riding habit a nice change of pace from her usual silhouette. Yellow was an incredibly popular color in France during the 18th century, in large part because of Europe's growing fascination with East Asia, specifically China, as a result of increased trade. This interest first began with the rise of the chinoiserie style in the 17th century, which was the European interpretation of East Asian art that proceeded to become a staple of the Rococo movement. With yellow believed to represent Chinese palaces, temples, and emperors, European aristocrats quickly began dressing in the color as a status symbol. Outwardly, Martille comes across as welcoming, good-natured, and cheery, but it's the little details like the black buttons, stiff shape, and high collar which make it clear that she's being duplicitous and hiding her true intentions. From the beginning, her character has been shown to be rather villainous, but it's through this manipulation of Cecile that we can see how truly psychopathic she is. One of the most impressive aspects about the film's costumes are that they were made with an absurdly small budget. The entire film was allotted only $14 million, which would practically be considered an indie project today. And I can't even imagine how much money the costume department got. So you really have to give Aitchison a round of applause for not just working with what he had, but making magic with it. There's probably no better testament to his amazing craftsmanship than the fact that these costumes continue to be reused in other projects, including 1991's Dark Shadows, 1993's Hocus Pocus, 2013's Belle, and 2017's Harlots. Madonna even wore one of the gowns from the film in an iconic performance of Vogue at the 1990 VMAs. Most of the costumes have survived their trips to other sets. Keyword, most. Following the success of Dangerous Liaisons, Aitchison would sign on to 1992's Last of the Mohicans, but would later leave the film because of disagreements with the film's director, Michael Mann. Designer Elsa Zamparelli was brought in to finish the film's costumes, but Aitchison's work can still be seen in the finished product. Notably, the character Alice wears the robe à la française that had previously been created for Michelle Pfeiffer in Dangerous Liaisons. Sadly, the beautiful gown was damaged beyond repair for the film, possibly one of Aitchison's qualms with the project, and the production company for Last of the Mohicans was later fined $24,000 for the destruction of the garment. Mirror, Mirror. The final project costume designer Eiko Ishioka completed before her death from pancreatic cancer in 2012, she was sadly unable to watch the completed film, but she did receive a posthumous nomination for her work at the Oscars. That year, 2 different films inspired by the Brothers Grimm fairy tale were up for the award: Snow White and the Huntsman with costumes by Colleen Atwood, and Mirror Mirror by Ishioka. Both films were absolutely stunning to look at, and I would have been hard-pressed to choose a winner, if it weren't for Anna Karenina, which eventually took home the award. Mirror Mirror took the dark story of Snow White in a more comedic and camp direction than other adaptations, something that was mirrored in the costuming, which was playful, colorful, and whimsical. The film is purposely vague about its time period and location, allowing Ishioka to take creative liberties with the costumes, combining trends from the 16th century all the way through the 19th century. Ishioka's disregard for historical accuracy is perhaps best exemplified by the various characters' outlandish undergarments, which, while effective in helping create the overstated silhouette that defines the film, aren't necessarily rooted in reality. We see her combine 18th century stays with 19th century crinolines, and 19th century corsets with 18th century panniers and 16th century farthingales, all for comedic effect. The film's most extravagant costumes are donned by Julia Roberts as the Evil Queen, a reflection of the character's vanity, arrogance, and selfishness. While her costumes seem to take most of their inspiration from 18th century French court dress, she also sports the ruffs, partlets, and hanging sleeves that were popular in England during the late 16th century, perhaps as an ode to Queen Elizabeth, who was seen as the ultimate ruler. Her gowns are absolutely massive, with most of them measuring 6 feet in circumference, while her feathery wedding gown, perhaps one of the most elaborate costumes in the film, was 8 feet in diameter and weighed a remarkable 60 pounds. Her dresses often feature strong shoulders, high collars, and pointed embellishments, which immediately makes her appear more threatening in comparison to Snow's rounded silhouettes and shapes. When we're first introduced to Snow White, she's wearing a pink and yellow princess dress, which is appliqued and brocaded with dainty florals to highlight her connection to nature. These soft colors allude to the character's innocence and kindness, while also emphasizing her very pale complexion and making her hair appear even darker, two of Snow White's most recognizable features. While the queen's skirts are reminiscent of the robe à la polonaise and the robe à la française of the 1700s, Snow's bell-like skirt is more recent, likely paying homage to the popular silhouette of the mid-1800s. The queen's gowns often feature a triangle bodice, which was popular during the Elizabethan era, while Snow's is more similar to what would have been worn during the Tudor era. Snow later dons a bright yellow cloak on her first trip outside of the castle, and it is positively stunning. It not only complements the rest of her ensemble, but also makes her impossible to miss amongst the grays and whites of the forest and village, although you could argue that that's the opposite of what she'd want, considering she's supposed to be incognito. Although a slightly different color palette, the two-tone dress does somewhat remind me of the outfit worn by Disney's animated Snow White. The Young Victoria. Sandy Powell makes her second appearance on this list for 2009's The Young Victoria, which chronicles the early life and reign of the titular royal, beginning in 1836 and ending in 1840. The film showcases an assortment of fashion trends that were unique to the era, including the corded petticoat which preceded the crinolines of the mid-19th century and gave gowns of the 1830s their signature shape. We also see the female characters sport the elaborate Apollo knot hairstyle which defined the decade, a trend which is rarely embraced by Hollywood as it looks a bit odd to the modern eye. Powell's research involves studying royal portraiture, written references, and even examining Queen Victoria's actual clothing. Although the film takes place primarily in the late 1830s, some of the costumes reference fashions from the mid-1840s, a historical inaccuracy that Powell likely made to not only highlight the passage of time, but to also capture the character's evolution from timid heir to confident queen. During her early years, Victoria's dresses, which just barely skim the floor, feature pastel colors like pink, yellow, and light blue, and are adorned with ruffles and lace, all of which emphasize her youthfulness and naivete. As Victoria gains independence and assumes her role as queen, her costumes lose this juvenile quality, with her dresses becoming more fitted to better highlight her figure, having less trim and ornamentation, longer skirts, and featuring darker and more assertive colors. Besides this transition mirroring Victoria's character development, it also aligns with the shift in fashion trends, from the playful and decorative style of the 1830s to the sleeker and more restrained fashions of the 1840s. Victoria wears this pale yellow gown for the king's birthday, which is probably one of the most glaringly juvenile dresses that she wears in the entire film. The dress features a floral printed fabric, lace trim, a bow at the waist, and yellow roses on the bodice. And while all of these elements were rather common in late 1830s formal wear, to the modern eye it's reminiscent of a child's party dress. If that wasn't enough, Powell further highlights Victoria's innocence and powerlessness by dressing her mother in a garish green gown, a color which is not only symbolic of her greed, but could also allude to her snake-like behavior. At her coronation ball, Victoria dons an elevated version of the gown that immediately signals to the audience that she's grown up. The two dresses feature many of the same elements, but the subtle changes make a world of difference. The most obvious is the color, with her coronation gown being a rich gold instead of a pale yellow. You'll also note that the roses are now red, a color that is often used to symbolize passion and romance. Even the silhouette of the gown is different, having a lower neckline and smaller skirt, while the lower placement of the bow draws attention to her waist, all of which highlight that she's blossomed into a young woman. It kind of reminds me of Belle's dress in Beauty and the Beast, the animated version, not the live action. And it's also eerily similar to the gold gown worn by Paulette Goddard in 1942's Reap the Wild Wind, which was set during a similar time period as The Young Victoria. Crimson Peak. Directed by Guillermo del Toro, Crimson Peak is a loving ode to the Gothic genre and has some of the best period costuming in recent years. Taking place in 1901, Edith Cushing, an American heiress and aspiring author, meets the near-destitute Sir Thomas Sharp and his sister Lucille while they're visiting the States from England. Edith quickly becomes romantically interested in Thomas, much to her father's chagrin, who proceeds to bribe the peculiar pair to leave the country. However, Thomas returns, and after the mysterious murder of Edith's father, they marry, leaving America for the Sharps' rundown mansion, where Edith soon becomes ill and begins seeing ghosts. The characters' age, wealth, class, and personalities are reflected in the clothing they wear, with Edith's more modern designs creating a stark juxtaposition between herself and the Sharp siblings. Edith often wears yellow, a color that is symbolic of her passion for life and hope for the future, as well as white, which alludes to her innocence and purity. She's like the sun. Comparatively, Lucille exclusively wears dark shades, showing how reserved, cruel, and pessimistic she is. Nothing can grow under her gaze. Costume designer Kate Hawley directly confirmed this intention in an interview. Quote, "It's all about opposites. It's opposite to blue on the color chart. It's the sun and the moon. It's night and day. It's summer and winter. It's starvation and fertility." At the beginning of the film, Edith's clothes are fairly relaxed with masculine touches, something Hawley stated was intended to highlight that she was a modern Victorian woman at the start of the suffrage movement. Although it's meant to be 1901, her dresses more closely resemble fashions of the 1890s, lacking the top-heavy pigeon breast silhouette that became popular at the turn of the century. Once Edith joins the Sharps at their estate, her wardrobe has the subtlest shift. While she'd previously been wearing somewhat muted shades of yellow, the saturation gets turned all the way up, further highlighting how she doesn't belong in the Sharps' dull and dreary world. You'll also notice that further into the film, she begins to sport green, the combination of her signature yellow and the Sharps' blues. As Edith gets further pulled into the chaos and horror, her wardrobe becomes more elaborate, with her sleeves growing increasingly larger and her gowns featuring more intricate details, tying into the absurdity of the situation she's found herself in. Lucille's gowns look quite different from Edith's, taking direct inspiration from the natural form era, which occurred between 1877 and 1882, a purposeful choice that symbolizes Lucille's desire to hold on to the past, while also highlighting her strangeness and current economic struggles. Even their nightgowns reflect their differing circumstances, with Lucille's being more simple while Edith's is elaborate. All of Lucille's gowns are meant to have belonged to her dead mother, which I think is a clever way of referencing how the Sharp siblings continue to be haunted by their actions. I got so many comments in the red dress episode lamenting Lucille's exclusion, even though I'd already planned on talking about it in this video. So I hope you guys are happy now. The gown was actually a last-minute addition, with Guillermo del Toro and Jessica Chastain requesting it 2 weeks prior to filming. Hawley wanted the dress to allude to the ghosts that haunt Crimson Peak, as well as Lucille's murderous intentions and the tragedies that Edith is about to experience. The large train symbolized a pool of blood, while the back of the bodice was intended to resemble an exposed spine. Even the collar has small beads hanging from it which were made to look like drops of blood. The dress covers up a good deal of Lucille's body, a metaphor for how she's hiding her true intentions, while also making Edith's white gown all the more revealing and sensual. Annie. An adaptation of the 1977 Broadway musical of the same name, which was in turn inspired by the comic strip Little Orphan Annie, which debuted in 1924, 1982's Annie was one of my favorite movies as a kid, and combined with the American Girl books about Kit Kittredge, it prompted a childhood fascination with the Great Depression. Set in 1933, the film follows a young orphan named Annie who is invited to live with the billionaire Oliver Warbucks for a week in order to improve his public image. Anne Reinking stars as Mr. Warbucks' secretary, Grace Farrell, who starts off the film in tailored jackets, starched blouses, and stiff skirts in neutral colors, which are all symbolic of her professionalism and formality. As the story develops, she becomes Annie's mother figure and Mr. Warbucks' love interest, with her wardrobe shifting to suit her new role. This change first occurs after she and Mr. Warbucks take Annie to the movies, with Grace asking if they can adopt Annie officially the following day. And despite his initial rejection of the idea, Mr. Warbucks relents, not so subtly implying that he's doing so to make Grace happy. This yellow chiffon dress is significantly less restrictive and more colorful than what she'd been wearing previously, making it the perfect ensemble for a celebratory dance number. Not to mention that it's also a more romantic color and silhouette, which ties into her and Mr. Warbucks' breakfast flirtation. Like many of the costumes in the film, the dress is vaguely reminiscent of fashions from the early 1930s, just with a shorter hem and looser fit. In the 1980s, there was actually a bit of a 1930s revival, and as a result, this dress looks like something you could actually find in a catalog from 1982. West Side Story. The second film adaptation of the 1957 musical of the same name, which in turn was inspired by William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, West Side Story follows the rivalry between the Jets and the Sharks, two street gangs of different ethnic backgrounds. Tony is a former member of the Jets and best friends with the gang's leader, Riff, but he proceeds to fall in love with Maria, the sister of the Sharks' leader, Bernardo. Taking place in Manhattan, the conflict between the groups is fueled by racism as well as economic insecurity, with the neighborhood they're both battling over on the verge of being destroyed to make room for fancy new apartments. The differences between the two groups are expressed through their clothing choices, with costume designer Paul Tazewell dressing the Jets in a cooler color palette, heavily influenced by classic Americana, with blue jeans, t-shirts, sneakers, and bomber jackets. Whereas the Sharks, who are Puerto Rican, wear warmer colors, slacks, dress shoes, and button-ups, with Tazewell saying, quote, "They're styled more formally because it's aspirational. They're dressing to attain their own self-respect and the respect of other people." The female characters also dress in a way that makes their allegiances known, with the girlfriends of the Jets wearing shades of blue, while the girlfriends of the Sharks wear yellows and reds. The dresses themselves also have different silhouettes, with the Jets girls wearing designs that are rather minimalistic, while the Shark girls have lower necklines and flowier skirts, creating a look that is reminiscent of traditional Puerto Rican clothing. One of my favorite looks from the 1961 movie is the purple dress worn by Bernardo's girlfriend, Anita, for the America number, but I adore the switch to yellow in the 2021 film. According to Tazewell, the reason for this change was, quote, "It's in a different position when the song is played. For our version, the dress is worn for daytime. We're on this tour of the city with Bernardo and Anita. Then you have the Sharks following behind them. And we see the relationship of that gang and their girlfriends and what that community is, and the love that they have for Anita and Bernardo and for each other. I really wanted Anita to be like the sun, to be the center of that community and hold that kind of energy and exuberance that was then reflective of the rest of the neighborhood." In order to capture her vivaciousness, confidence, and sexuality, Anita's wardrobe throughout the film took inspiration from 1950s starlets like Elizabeth Taylor and Marilyn Monroe, with this dress featuring both a Bardot neckline and a halter top. She wears a red petticoat under the dress, her signature color, which breaks up the otherwise monochromatic look and allows her to match with Bernardo. Till the clouds roll by. What you need to understand is that historical accuracy hasn't always been Hollywood's priority, especially in the 1940s and 50s. Sure, there were a few one-off projects that put some effort into recreating period clothing, but for the most part they interpreted historical styles under the lens of contemporary fashions, with 1946's Till the Clouds Roll By being a perfect example of the phenomenon. A fictionalized biopic about composer Jeremy Kern, the movie musical takes place over the course of the 1910s and 20s, something you wouldn't realize by watching it. The female characters not only sport distinctly 1940s hairstyles, but the silhouette of their gowns barely show any progression of time. However, that doesn't make me like this yellow number worn by Judy Garland any less. In what was basically a glorified cameo intended to show off her dancing and singing abilities, Garland stars as Broadway actress Marilyn Miller for a handful of songs. The musical number was directed by Garland's then-husband, Vincente Minnelli, and she actually filmed her scenes whilst pregnant with their daughter, Liza, something the choreographer and costume designer desperately attempted to hide. The yellow gown had beaded embellishments on the bust and a feathered skirt which moved beautifully during the performance, and it's actually one of my favorite dresses that Judy Garland ever wore. This style of dress has become near synonymous with ballroom dancing, as seen in 1992's Strictly Ballroom. And Jennifer Lopez even wore a similar dress in 2004's Shall We Dance, which almost made it onto this list because I think it's so stunning. Babes in Toyland. If you're a fan of old Hollywood musicals like Chitty Chitty Bang Bang or Mary Poppins, I'd recommend checking this one out if you haven't before. Based on the 1903 operetta, Babes in Toyland follows the Mother Goose nursery rhyme characters Mary Contrary and Tom Piper as they're about to be married, only for the dastardly villain Barnaby to kidnap Tom and plot to marry Mary himself. A Technicolor dream, all of the costumes are vibrant and sweet, a combination of late 1950s fashion trends and the ornamental styles of the 18th century. This influence is probably most noticeable in Mary's first outfit, which has an overskirt and a bodice that resembles a pair of stays. My favorite dress of Mary's is actually this blue embroidered number with green trim and matching lace-up corselet. It's just one of those dresses you see as a little kid and never forget about. Her yellow dress pales a bit in comparison, but I needed to get this movie into this series somehow. Mary wears the dress with a pinafore for most of the film, which is absolutely precious, but then she adds a mustard cape, which I personally find to be hideous, especially if you compare it to the one that we saw in Mirror Mirror. She later removes the cape and pinafore, leaving just the dress, which, while pretty, could probably have included a few more blue embellishments as it's Mary's signature color. Casino. Taking place in Las Vegas during the 1970s and early 80s, 1995's Casino is one of director Martin Scorsese's glitzier and gaudier projects, with costume designer Rita Raic and John A. Dunn reportedly working on a $1 million budget. Ginger McKenna, played by Sharon Stone, is the film's secondary antagonist, and has the greatest fashion evolution over the course of the film. Previously a sex worker and showgirl before marrying Sam Rothstein, Ginger is charismatic and beautiful, and with Sam's money she's able to dress in the expensive gowns, jewelry, and furs she'd long been dreaming of. I'm sure most people think of Ginger's white mini dress or her gold grape gown when they think of her iconic outfits, but I've always had a fondness for this yellow and white chevron halter dress. Appearing on screen only for a brief moment, the dress is one of many in the film which were designed by the legendary Bob Mackie, who also dressed Cher and Diana Ross. An incredibly bold choice, the dress highlights the character's confidence, opulence, and charisma. The gown would later be spotted on Fran Drescher in an episode of the TV series The Nanny, having been specifically requested by the actress after she saw it on Sharon Stone. Mohra. In Western films, red is often used as a shorthand for sensuality and passion, but in Bollywood, yellow has that honor. Although the color had been worn by numerous actresses over the years, it was the 1994 action thriller film Mohra that first gave yellow saris their current connotation. Worn by actress Raveena Tandon for the dance number Tip Tip Barsapani, the sultry scene where she dances in the rain made her a sex symbol overnight and started a trend of yellow saris. Her simple sheer chiffon sari with ruffled sleeves allowed her to stand out against the blues and grays of the background, and it's no surprise that the color proceeded to become a staple of Bollywood rain sequences following the release of the film. The song and dance number was later recreated for the 2021 film Suryavanshi, but I'm not gonna lie, I don't think the silver sari pops half as much as the original. Clueless. Okay, let's get this out of the way. I know that this isn't actually a dress, but if I didn't include it in the video, you guys would never let me hear the end of it. Not to mention that it is generally one of the most iconic yellow outfits in the entire history of film. Clueless is a modern adaptation of Jane Austen's 1815 novel, Emma, with the bossy English protagonist being turned into 16-year-old Cher Horowitz, a popular and wealthy high schooler who lives in Beverly Hills. The costumes in the film were designed by the legendary Mona May, the mind behind Romy and Michelle's high school reunion, Xenon the Sequel, Stuck in the Suburbs, Enchanted, and The House Bunny. Over the course of the film, Cher wears over 50 different outfits, with actress Alicia Silverstone stating in interviews that she absolutely hated the fitting process, not realizing the importance of all the different outfits until watching the film herself. Because Cher is meant to be the queen bee, director Amy Heckerling wanted her style to be ahead of its time, and as such, her look was heavily influenced by trends that were coming down the runway instead of what was being sold in stores. One of the character's most iconic looks is this yellow plaid set, which according to Mona May, was actually one of the most difficult outfits to figure out. They tried on several different iterations of the plaid suit from red to blue, but once Alicia tried it on in yellow, they fell in love. The color made her look like sunshine, symbolic of the fact that she's not only the center of her own world, but firmly believes that she's brightening others' lives as well. In the years since the release of the film, the yellow suit has not only become a go-to Halloween costume, but it's also been referenced in other media, like the music video for Iggy Azalea's Fancy and the music video for K-pop group Luna's Love Forever. Alicia Silverstone has also referenced the look in the years since. Even in the most recent adaptation of Emma, starring Anya Taylor-Joy, they take a moment to reference the look with the character wearing a bright yellow pelisse. I go into more detail about this outfit and others from the movie in the style analysis video, so check that out if you're interested. Or you can even watch my interview with Mona May. How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days. At this point, it's practically a requirement for a rom-com to have a scene where the main character appears in a jaw-dropping dress. Just think about Pretty Woman, Miss Congeniality, Made in Manhattan, or Crazy Rich Asians. All of these are memorable in their own way, but one rom-com look that is difficult to beat is the yellow gown worn by Kate Hudson in 2003's How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days. The film is one of many that employs the popular bet trope, which is when a character makes a wager for their own gain that requires them to date someone, only to eventually develop genuine feelings for them. The other person learns about the bet, resulting in a breakup because of this betrayal, before they eventually reconcile. In a rare turn of events, in How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, both parties have made their own bets to further their careers, with Benjamin Barry setting out to make a woman fall in love with him in 10 days, while Andy Anderson is determined to do the opposite by making a guy break up with her in the same amount of time. With Andy working as a journalist for a trendy New York City magazine, costume designer Karen Patch chose to dress her in clothes that were mostly off the rack, as it helped make the film and the character appear to be rooted in reality. As a result, instead of custom designs, Andy wears pieces by recognizable brands like Prada, Burberry, Marc Jacobs, and Yves Saint Laurent. The yellow satin dress that she wears near the end of the film is the one exception, being a collaboration between the film's costume designer and the team at Carolina Herrera, with the goal being a look that was timeless and chic. It sort of reminds me of this look from Carolina Herrera's Fall 2002 ready-to-wear collection, just in yellow and not quite as low-cut. According to the costume designer, a mossy green and a midnight blue version of the dress were made for initial camera tests, but once Kate Hudson tried it on in yellow, they knew it was meant to be. The gown is stunning as is, especially with its plunging back, but the look isn't fully complete until Andy dons a giant diamond necklace. Known as the Isadora diamond, the 84-carat rock was first worn by Whoopi Goldberg at the 2002 Oscars, before Harry Winston incorporated it into a new design custom-made for Kate Hudson's character in the film, and the necklace was later sold for $5 million following its release. The style of the dress was inspired by the yellow diamond itself, with Karen Patch saying, quote, "I wanted to design a dress that lived up to the jewels and not overpower them, which is why from the front the dress is rather simple in order to draw your eye towards the diamond." You might have noticed a similarity to the 128-carat yellow diamond owned by Tiffany & Co., which was previously worn by Audrey Hepburn in promotional materials for 1961's Breakfast at Tiffany's, before being reset more recently into a necklace that is reminiscent of the one in How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, with the new necklace being worn by Lady Gaga and Beyoncé, with a replica also being made for Gal Gadot in Death on the Nile. Because costume design and preservation weren't a big thing in the 2000s, especially in regard to films with a contemporary setting, the location of the yellow dress is currently a mystery, but that hasn't stopped people from attempting to recreate it, with mass-produced dupes of the gown going viral regularly. Even though the film is now 20 years old, Kate Hudson still can't escape this dress, and apart from her stint as Penny Lane in 2000's Almost Famous, it's probably her most iconic look, to the point that she can't wear a yellow dress without a comparison being made. Dune. Sci-fi films have long benefited from the fact that they aren't rooted in reality, with films like Barbarella, The Fifth Element, and Star Wars creating utterly unique worlds through their experimental costume design. Despite it seeming as though the well for creativity had run dry, 2021's Dune, an adaptation of the 1965 novel, has managed to set itself apart from other similar projects thanks to the design efforts of Jacqueline West and Bob Morgan, who created about 2,000 costumes for the film. Although the story is set 10,000 years in the future, the costumes for Dune pulled from historical references, with West describing the aesthetic as medieval, a modern take on medieval times. Lady Jessica, the mother of the film's protagonist Paul Atreides and consort to his father, is also a member of the Bene Gesserit, an exclusive sisterhood who have obtained powers through years of physical and mental training. Jessica's duality is expressed through her clothing. While she's mystical, devout, and level-headed, she's also a vicious warrior who's willing to use her sexuality to her own benefit. Lady Jessica's attire is simultaneously conservative and conspicuous, with her masks and veils highlighting how influential and powerful she is without drawing attention to her actions. Her jewelry is used to illustrate her position as a concubine instead of a noble, with their chain-like details being symbolic of how she's tied to the Duke and unable to escape her destiny and duty. When she arrives on Arrakis, she wears this yellow gown which features handmade chainmail, an ode to the medieval era, while the rest of the look takes inspiration from the Middle East. Can you think of any yellow dresses that should have made this list? With green coming up in the next episode, what are your favorite green dresses in film? I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!